Okay, welcome to video 2 where we discuss the dermis as well as a lot of the other accessory structures mostly found in the dermis. So let's begin looking at the two regions of the dermis. So I'll remind you that the epidermis is epithelial tissue. Well, the dermis is primarily connective tissue as its kind of base, and then it might have some other tissue in it. So, for example, this is a muscle, so it's got muscle tissue in it. And it's got a blood vessel here, so the blood vessel has epithelial tissue and all kinds of other tissues. So, there's a lot of tissues found in the dermis, but primarily it's connective tissues. We take that dermis and we're going to divide it into two regions. The more superficial region, so that means it's going to be up here close to the epidermis, is known as the papillary region. And papillary is in reference to these little waves here. They're not really waves, they're little projections of the dermis that stick up into the epidermis. Those are known as dermal papillae. Um, Papillae or a papilla refers to kind of a little projection. A synonym of that is kind of a nipple shape or pimple shape. So that's what these little waves are. So just beneath that is the papillary region. Notice that it's only 1/5 of the dermis, so that's about 20%, whereas the rest of it, the 80%, is this deeper reticular region. So, papillary region, superficial, 1/5 of the dermis, so it's directly below the basement membrane, primarily areolar connective tissue. So, I'll remind you that areolar connective tissue is going to have a little collagen in there, it'll have a little elastic fibers in there, it's got a little of those protein fibers. And areolar connective tissue is usually almost always beneath an epithelial tissue. So if the epidermis is epithelial tissue, just below it is areolar connective tissue. It forms those dermal papillae, so those little projections up into the epidermis. There's going to be some smaller blood vessels. So if you get a cut into that, you're going to bleed a little bit. Sitting inside these little dermal papillae, this is a blood vessel, but there's also these touch receptors called Meissner corpuscles. Now, this drawing doesn't happen to show them, unfortunately, but we will look at these in a subsequent image coming up. You might have some free nerve endings that do a lot of our sensory perception as well. So that's the papillary region. Then we go deep. We go down into this deeper area. And down here is where you're going to find a lot of that irregular connective tissue. So we're going to have a lot of collagen fibers. The collagen is much thicker down here. It's kind of running irregularly in different directions to give that dermis a lot of strength in different directions. There also is going to be some elastin fibers, so that gives your skin the ability to stretch a little bit. As you go deeper and deeper, you start to actually see some adipocytes as well. Then when you get to that hypodermis, or also known as that subcutaneous region, you find a lot of these adipocytes. So you have a lot of this adipose tissue deep down. So if you ever have a cut and you start to see a little yellowish tissue, that's a really deep cut. And that means you've probably gotten down into that hypodermis. Blood vessels start to get larger. The deeper you go, you can see hair surrounded by hair follicles. So a hair follicle, if you notice, if you follow that tissue that surrounds the hair, it actually is continuous with the epidermis. So that hair follicle is actually epidermal cells that surround the hair follicle. So they're kind of derived from that epidermis. And we'll talk more about hair going forward, but you can see that hair sitting in that hair follicle. A lot of nerves, again, sensory structures in that dermis. And then you're going to find a lot of the glands here. Sebaceous glands produce oil, and they're connected to the follicle. So that's this kind of bulbous tissue sticking off of the hair follicle. That's a sebaceous gland. You're going to find sweat glands. So here's a sweat gland or sudoriferous gland. And then when it produces that sweat, it travels up the sweat duct. And then eventually there's a little sweat pore up on the surface there. So we see some sebaceous glands, some sudoriferous glands. We see that muscle. Here's an erector pili muscle, which is going to be stimulated during fear. Sometimes if you get scared, your hair will stand up. Other stressors include cold temperatures will make your hair stand up. But that erector pili muscle, you'll notice, is connected to the follicle. And when it contracts, that hair will stand up. The Pacinian corpuscles are another type of sensory structure that's found much deeper in your skin. So here they show one kind of in that reticular region, and that is a sensor that picks up pressure and vibrations. So notice that the name of the region, so again, you got papillary and then reticular. That tends to be a little confusing because in the tissue chapter, we learned about a tissue called reticular connective tissue. But that tissue is not found in this region. It's irregular connective tissue. So they kind of made a mistake naming it because it's going to confuse A&P1 students. So keep in mind the reticular region of your dermis is not reticular connective tissue. It is irregular connective tissue. Okay, moving on. Let's take a closer look at some of these sensory receptors you have in your skin. So you'll notice some of them we refer to as free nerve endings. That's most likely because they don't have these large structures that are utilized called corpuscles. They're going to have little tiny receptors that detect whatever stimulus they detect. So pain. So pain receptors could be in here. So pain receptors are going to respond to tissue damage. They're also going to respond to extreme temperatures, so like extreme heat or extreme cold. You might have tickle receptors, temperature receptors, which again, they're going to detect changes in temperature, itch sensations, all kinds of sensory structures. Many different senses are due to these free nerve endings. The larger nerve endings are corpuscles. So you've got these Meissner corpuscles, which again, they're going to be part of your sense of touch. Deeper down, you might have a Pacinian corpuscle, which is for pressure. Now, what's interesting, think about where you might have many of these touch sensors. So you're going to have a lot of these guys in the tips of your fingers, right? Because you use those tips of your fingers when you're really trying to, touch something or feel something. So if you're in, say, Publix and you feel, fruit to see if it's ripe or not, you're going to use your tips of your fingers. Pressure sensors tend to be highly concentrated on the bottom of your feet, because that's where your body senses a lot of pressure changes. So if we were to look at skin on the bottom of your feet, you're going to have a lot of these guys. If we look at the skin at the tips of your fingers, you're going to have a lot of these guys. And there's some other sensory structures we're not going to really get into, but I definitely want you to know the difference between Pacinian corpuscles and the Meissner corpuscles. All right, hair and hair follicles. So like I mentioned, I'm not a big fan of hair because I lost mine years ago, but since I have to teach anatomy of the skin, we got to learn a little bit about hair and hair follicles. So the hair follicle is the container. Again, it's part of the epidermis that surrounds that hair. It's going to have an erector pili muscle attached to cause that hair to stand up. So there's the little muscle there. It's smooth muscle, so it's involuntarily controlled. Again, usually a stress response, either fear or, even cold temperatures. A hair itself has different parts. So if we start up here, the part that extends from the skin is known as the shaft. The part that's surrounded by the follicle, so it's down in the actual skin, is the root. And then the very, very bottom of a hair is known as the bulb. And that's because it's a little thicker down there. In the bulb, there's a little notch, and that's known as the hair papilla. So there's that name papilla again. But that's where you find blood vessels. That's what supplies that hair with nutrients and oxygen. So this hair is going to grow a lot like the epidermis, and that the cells that are close to those blood vessels are going to grow really well and then get pushed up. And as they migrate away from that blood vessel, they die and they harden up, and that's what a hair is. It's a very hard, dead keratinocytes. So that's an important structure to understand, the hair papilla. If you use a laser and zap and destroy that blood vessel, that hair won't grow. If you pull the hair out, it'll just regrow a hair because you didn't damage those blood vessels. Okay, so that's a hair. We're not going to really look at these different layers down here in this image. Here's what a real hair would look like if you happen to slice perfectly through it and look at it under the microscope. Notice what else is attached there. We have those sebaceous glands, which we'll talk more about coming up. Nails, kind of the same idea. We're not going to go crazy and talk about all the different structures here, but a nail is very similar. It's very hard, dense, loaded with keratin, and its job is to protect those distal ends of your fingers. And you don't really appreciate your nails until you might lose one. Someone who might have lost a fingernail, they really realize how important that nail is to protecting the ends of your fingers and toes. But some of the structures you'll notice, you have a little cuticle here, right? There's the cuticle. That's kind of a piling of skin over top of that nail root down here. You can see the nail body growing out, and then the free end is what you might trim with your nail clippers and hopefully don't chew them. You got kind of a nail bed underneath, but it grows from back here and then just kind of gets pushed all the way out. So those are your nails. Again, I wouldn't be too concerned about identifying anything on these images. All right, but we do want to spend time on glands. Glands is a very important area in learning about the integumentary system. We're going to focus on 4 types of glands. These are all exocrine glands. The 5th one are mammary glands. Mammary glands are actually considered a skin gland, a kind of a modification of a skin gland, but we won't really cover those until the reproductive system. So we've got 2 types of sudoriferous glands. Sudoriferous are sweat glands. There are the eccrine sweat glands and the apocrine sweat glands. Major differences include the locations, the sweat's a little bit different, and then the onset. The eccrine sweat glands, they're functioning right away at birth, whereas the apocrine glands don't function till puberty. So eccrine sweat glands throughout most areas of the body, highly concentrated on your forehead so you can cool your brain. Your arms have a lot of sweat glands. Your palms, your hands might get sweaty sometimes. Your soles have sweat glands, but they're really everywhere. We call that sweat hypotonic because it's very watery. So mostly water, some ions, and a little bit of waste. Urea, uric acid, and ammonia are all waste products. Most of that stuff is excreted in urine, but there's a little bit of it in this sweat. Sometimes if you overconsume something, so let's say you had a nice Italian meal and you load it up with garlic, sometimes you can get some spillover into your sweat as well. Function is thermoregulation, cooling the body. Also, a little bit of waste removal. And these can be stimulated a little bit by emotions. Sometimes we might get nervous about something, and some sweat starts pouring off your forehead, and that's a normal thing when it comes to these sweat glands. We're going to see with the apocrine glands, they're even more stimulated by emotions, and in particular, sexual excitement. So apocrine sweat glands produce their sweat a little differently. Remember what apocrine means. It means that the cells actually break off little chunks. So now this sweat's going to have more lipid and protein in it from those chunks of cells. And that's what bacteria feed on. So your armpits are going to smell a little bit, not because the sweat smells, it's because the byproducts that are produced when the bacteria are feeding on these lipids and proteins. So these glands are found more concentrated in your armpits or your axillary regions and your groin or inguinal regions. They tend to connect to hair follicles, and we'll look at that when we look at a drawing of these glands. But they tend to deliver that sweat directly into hair follicles. A little more sensitive to sexual excitement, thought as being a human pheromone. I always wonder about that because I don't know why anyone would be attracted to this smell, but who knows. And then again, they begin function at puberty. So those are your sweat glands. Sebaceous glands produce a more oily secretion. They're also kind of found throughout the body. They are definitely connected directly to hair follicles. This way, the oil will coat the hair as well as spill out onto the skin. So sebum is an oily substance, so it's loaded with triglycerides and cholesterol. There are going to be some proteins and salts in there as well. Primary function is prevent dehydration. You wouldn't want your epidermis to dehydrate and crack and therefore let microbes in. You also wouldn't want your hair breaking off. So it prevents dehydration of epidermis and hair. It also has some antibacterial properties. So it'll inhibit the growth of some bacteria. Now, you do have tons of bacteria growing on your skin, and this bacteria is actually very good to have on your skin, but you wouldn't want overgrowth of bacteria. All right, finally, earwax. We know where that is. That's found in our external auditory canal. The glands are called ceruminous glands because the waxy material is known as cerumen. So this earwax is there for a reason. It helps prevent entry of any kind of foreign substances. So this could be kind of just particulates, or it could actually be organisms, little tiny microbes and little tiny even insects could try to get into your ear canal. And there's been studies that have determined that, throughout our life, many insects try to enter your ears. So it's nice to have a little bit of protection there. It also helps to kind of waterproof your ear canal. So that's the major information about your different glands. Here's a nice drawing showing at least the sweat glands as well as the sebaceous gland. So there's your sebaceous gland. You always see it kind of sticking off of a hair follicle, secreting that sebum up into that follicle. There's the eccrine sweat gland. So these glands are a little closer to the surface, so they're a little more superficial than the apocrine gland. They also have their ducts kind of going directly to the surface of the epidermis. Whereas the apocrine glands, they tend to be a little bigger, so the glandular part, and their ducts often attach to the follicle. So they're going to be secreting up into that follicle a lot like the sebaceous glands do. So that's kind of what they would look like and where they're located. The next topic we're going to kind of quickly go through is how your skin might repair itself. And there's a couple different processes your skin might use based on how deep the wound might be. So this, these upper two panels show what we would call epidermal wound healing, where it's only the epidermis that may have been damaged. Whereas down here, we have bigger problems because we've got dermal and deeper damage. When it's just the epidermis, it's pretty straightforward. You just want to replace all those strata. So the cells will kind of migrate over. So these basal cells will migrate over across that basement membrane, and then they'll actually grow a little faster than normal. So they'll really kick in their mitosis, and they'll replace those layers. So that's known as epidermal wound healing. When we have damage to the dermis, we're going to have a bigger problem because we might have blood vessel damage, we might have bacteria entering. So dermal damage is going to cause an inflammatory response or inflammation. And inflammation is typically due to tissue damage. So we have tissue damage down in here. The goal is to prevent infection and repair the tissue very quickly. So we're going to get a lot of blood flow to the area. So that's why if you ever have inflammation, you're usually going to have redness, and the tissue is going to feel hot because that blood is hot and blood is red. And how we get more blood there is the blood vessels will dilate. So this is a dilated blood vessel. Means it's gotten bigger. And that'll bring in more blood flow. It'll bring in these white blood cells here, which are part of your immune system. So they're going to be in there killing off any kind of bacteria. So we try to prevent infection. We also replace that tissue very quickly. And how we do that is the fibroblasts, which if you recall fibroblasts from our tissue chapter, those are going to be producing fibers like collagen. So what they do is they'll just dump a whole bunch of collagen, all right? And that's what we call a scar. So the scar isn't going to be just like normal tissue because we don't care if it looks like normal tissue. We gotta reform that tissue. So it's largely collagen fibers that get formed there. Once the microbes are killed and the tissue is repaired, that inflammation can go away. We might have a scab form, and that's kind of part of this maturation phase. But at least we've got our nice blood vessel reformed. We prevented microbial infection, and we've left behind a little bit of scar tissue there. So that's called deep wound healing. The next video, our final video for this chapter, we're going to focus on the 3 major forms of skin cancer, and then we'll get into the different degrees of burns.